Continuing right out of the history of the great American fortunes, Gustavus Myers, he says this: in a day, as it were, the Morse Heinz Thomas Group, that's Heinz Carey now, Thomas Group was smashed into nothingness and its property seized. If the experience of those venturesome little magnates had ended there, they would have had cause to rejoice over their good fortune, but their rout had to be made complete. The federal authorities began to take a sudden interest in their operations, where previously the government's prosecuting officials had been wholly unaware that Morse, Heinz, and Thomas had been committing fraud in their financial methods. They now spied out the fullest evidences. From certain quarters, proofs were offered of violations of the law by the fallen trio. The United States District Attorney's Office in New York became alive with energy. It caused grand juries to investigate and showed striking official zeal in the prosecution. Heinz was indicted, Morse brought to trial, convicted, and sentenced to 15 years in prison, a verdict from which he appealed. The United States Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed the verdict. After serving some years in the federal prison in Atlanta, Morse was released. All this Morse Heinz. What we're talking about here is how much things don't change just because it's 100 years distant, all right? Yeah, we're 100 years distant from the time this was written, but we're dealing with the same corruption, the same government, the same bankers, the same corporations, the same families, time and time and time again. And because we just don't seem to learn from the lessons of the past, and because they were able to sweep us into not just one war, but two wars, Worldwide War I, Worldwide War II, Korea, etc., Vietnam, ever-ending line of wars, we just don't, always in the chat room talking about, how we're dealing, as I mentioned, we're dealing a death, that we're being dealt a death of 1,000 cuts here. The distractions are endless if you control the printing presses. Of course, there's questions as to whether or not you could actually cause an earthquake. Reminds me of the story about these two old guys down in the Bahamas sitting on a veranda looking out at the beautiful sunset, enjoying their mint juleps with the little umbrellas in them, and one fellow looks at the other, "What brings you to the Bahamas?" The fellow says, thinking on it for a minute, and he's rocking in his chair, and he says, "Well, this is bad fire, bad fire." A couple of minutes goes by, the fellow with the bad fire looks at the other fellow and says, "Well, what brings you to the Bahamas?" Rocks for a moment. The fellow says, "Well, bad flood, bad flood." The fellow who had the fire sit there, rock for a minute or two longer. Finally looks at the other boy and says, "How the hell do you start a flood? How do you start an earthquake? How do you start a war in the Middle East? How do you start spontaneous revolutions? How do you start a war in Vietnam? How do you start a war in Korea? How do you start a war with the Japanese? How do you start a war with the Germans?" Same people, same bunch of gangsters, same creeps, cretins, corruption. And they hide in these trusts, and they hide in their corporations, these legal fictions. As we find out, let's continue our study on that right out of the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences. It was generally believed in business and legal circles that corporate combinations could not be reached by the law. Couldn't be reached by the law. Couldn't pierce that corporate veil. The grounds for this anomalous belief were that under constitutional guarantees, the rights of owners of industrial plants or the stocks of manufacturing corporations to dispose of them to anyone whom they might choose could not be limited by statute. It was reasoned that the Sherman Act, resting as it did expressly upon the congressional power to regulate interstate commerce, back to that discussion again, could not be held to apply to transactions involving simply the transfer of title to industrial properties situated within the boundaries of particular states and in every instance consummated within those boundaries. And Berkshire Hathaway picks up lubes oil on top of their Burlington Northern Santa Fe holdings, raking in $1 billion in surplus cash every single month as they continue to add to their treasure chests, and the Koch brothers seek further creative destruction. Second largest private corporation. It seems plain from this standpoint that the Act could be upheld only if its applications were restricted to agreements and contracts dealing with the trade in the products of these industrial plants, which products did, of course, customarily move to market over state boundaries. So now we're back into the discussion between commerce, intrastate commerce, and interstate commerce, and the Commerce Clause right out of the Constitution. The widely held opinion based upon this line of reasoning was fortified by the decision in the E.C. Knight case, United States versus E.C. Knight Company, 156 U.S. 1, 1895, which validated the purchase of stock in competing corporations by the American Sugar Refining Company, in spite of the fact that the acquisition of the stock gave the company almost complete control of the cane sugar refining capacity of the country. Can we afford to allow any one company to hold a dominant, if not monopoly, position on natural resources? Does it give them more power than any one person ought have? Or not? Is that the idea of a free market, where through no fault perhaps of their own, other than just, acumen and business superlatives and all the best legal beagles that money can buy and all the best congresswoers that money can buy, ought we allow ourselves that kind of jeopardy? That we allow single people like Warren Buffett and others to have a monopoly, control Bill and Melinda Gates with Windows, the operating system that runs the world, Linux accepted? Continuing, the mere existence of monopoly was not clearly illegal. Patent monopolies, for instance, were not deprived of their privileges by the Sherman Act. It was only monopolizing which had been forbidden. Monopolizing. How clever. I shared with you the little brief bio of this Jonathan Rothschild off the American Bar Association's homepage. He's all big on this idea of being able to run intergenerational trusts and keep intact the pass-through from one generation to another generation of these big magnates, the captains of finance and industry out there. And there were precedents, continuing from the article, from which it might be concluded that monopolizing consisted not in the uniting of competitors, but only in practices of a nature designed to eliminate competitors against their will. You eliminate competitors against their will. This is your Standard Oil, all right? Let's go into this a little bit further. Now back to Gustavus Myers. But the grasping of the properties of the ousted combination were not the only seizures during those harvest days of the Panic of 1907. The Panic of 1907, they say that our recession started in 2007, 100 years distant. The electric apparatus factories of the Westinghouse Company had long been in the way of the Standard Oil interests, Rockefellers, which owned the General Electric Company, Mr. Imelt, sitting at the right hand of Barry the Usurper. Standard Oil interests exercised a financial pressure during the panic that soon drove the Westinghouse Company into a position from which it escaped only by becoming an auxiliary of those interests. It had to come into the hoop. And in the conferences held by the Wall Street financiers during the early days of the panic, Morgan, that would be J.P. Junius, learned that the control of the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company in the form of stock had been placed with the Trust Company of America by John W. Gates and his associates to secure loans, any ancestor to Bill and Melinda. This was information of the highest and most momentous value. The Steel Trust absorbs a dangerous competitor. The Tennessee Coal and Iron Company was the most dangerous competitor of the Steel Trust. It was one of the great competitors, having its own sources of iron ore and coal supply. In the fall of 1907, it owned, it was estimated, from 500 million to 700 million tons of iron ore, 2 billion tons of coal, and very large quantities of flux and fluxing materials. Wow. We'll be right back.